Hello and welcome to Principles of Micro with James Bland. In this class I am going to teach you about the determinants of deadweight loss. Specifically, we're going to attempt to work out what determines the size of the deadweight loss. And also, can we work out who is more worse off when we tax a market? Okay, and so, we in chapter I think it was 6 when we talked about taxation, this all came down to elasticity, right? So if a demand curve is relatively elastic compared to a supply curve, then the price that sellers receive is going to change a lot more compared to the price that consumers pay, sorry. And so we're going to have a similar story due to elasticity. Okay, so let's start out with a supply and demand diagram. So my computer isn't exactly flat here. That's better. Okay. Price, quantity, and just for a review, here's supply, here's demand, and the important part for this class is that if the government taxes a market by this amount, then we have price consumers pay up here and price sellers receive down here. In terms of what these areas are, this square, I'll go to a different color to label these. This square here is government revenue. Up here we have consumer surplus, and down here we have producer surplus after the tax. Okay, which means that the triangle to the right, so here's quantity with the tax, and here is quantity without the tax. This triangle here is surplus that someone would have got. This is going to be shared between consumers and producers. This is surplus that someone would have got before the tax, and now no one's getting, right? So some surplus ends up going to the government where consumers or producers got that, and but there's some surplus that's lost, and we call this deadweight loss. Okay, and so what we're going to ask in this class is what is going to determine the size of the deadweight loss. And this is going to come down to elasticity, and so on. Okay, and so where we're leading up to with this is that the more we'll get there. I don't want to jump ahead too much. Okay, so here we have. Let's start with a fresh supply and demand diagram. And let's think about what happens if we have a relatively elastic or inelastic demand curve keeping the supply curve constant. Okay, so we'll keep our supply curve constant, and let's suppose that here is our equilibrium quantity without taxes. And so that means that our demand curves are going to pass through this point. So let's draw a relatively elastic demand curve and a relatively inelastic, excuse me, I was meant to have a different color there, relatively inelastic demand curve like this. Okay. So let's put in a tax, and I'm going to try and draw this so that the size of the tax is about the same in both of these. In fact, I have a TV remote next to me, and I'm going to be using that as my ruler to make sure that I'm drawing the same size of the tax. Okay, excuse me. Okay. I need my red. Okay, so let's start out with the relatively inelastic demand. Okay, if I impose a tax equal to 1 TV remote's width of amount per tax, then we're going to drive a wedge between the inelastic demand curve and supply curve by this much. Okay, and so our deadweight loss is going to be equal to this triangle here. Okay. Now, if I impose a tax on the market with the relatively elastic demand, then the point where my TV remote just fits between the supply and demand curve for this blue demand curve is over here. So here's another height that's equal to the value of the same tax. And so here we have our other deadweight loss triangle. Okay, so let's shade these in different colors so we know which is which. Here's our yellow triangle, and let's go to a different color. Here is our pink one here. Okay, and really what we're going to ask here is, if I can get my color, which deadweight loss is bigger? If I can write an R properly there. There we go. Okay, so to do this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to shift this triangle so it lines up with that height there. Okay. To do that, we'll start out again by drawing a tax wedge, but we're just going to consider the supply and demand diagrams, or the supply and demand curves, as if they're shifted. Okay, so here's my tax wedge. Okay, and the supply curve is constant. Okay, so here's my supply curve coming through here. And we have a relatively elastic demand curve that's blue. So I'm going to draw this one coming through like this. And so there's our deadweight loss triangle for the elastic demand curve. So this is our elastic demand. And had green for the other one. We had an inelastic demand. Now the thing about this is that since I've shifted this triangle onto so the vertical parts of it line up well, that means that the other demand curve will be passing through this point, but because it's inelastic, it will be steeper. So if I've got a steeper downward sloping line starting from here, that's going to look something like this. Okay, so this is my inelastic demand. Okay, and what we can see here, and what colors did I use over here? The yellow triangle is now this one, right? That's the triangle that lines up with the inelastic demand curve on that diagram. The yellow triangle is completely inside the pink triangle. Okay, so what we get from this is that, if I can get my thing here, we have elastic demand implies a larger deadweight loss. And the way to think about this is that if we go back to our diagram here, maybe I'll have to get rid of a few of these annotations. If we have an elastic demand curve, which is this one along here, holding the supply curve constant, I need quantity to adjust by a lot, right? I need quantity to adjust by a lot to be able to drive the right wedge through supply and demand, so the difference in the height between the supply and demand curve is equal to the value of the tax. Whereas if I'm on my inelastic demand curve, then I don't need quantity to adjust by that much. Sorry, that's quantity with tax. Quantity with tax, call that 2. I don't need quantity to adjust by as much because I have an inelastic demand curve, right? We go up this demand curve a lot faster than we go up this one when we move to the left. Okay, or more formally, we go to the left slower up this one as we move up it. Okay, so the conclusion we get from here is that elastic demand means that we get a larger deadweight loss. Okay, I'm going to pause here and then have a think about what I'll tell you about supply. Okay, so now we're going to do the same thing for supply curves. And so let's suppose we've got a demand curve that's held fixed, and think about two supply curves that generate the same equilibrium quantity. Okay, so we can have a relatively, well, I want to have different colors here. We're going to have a relatively elastic demand curve, supply curve, sorry. And we're going to have a relatively inelastic supply curve, which is going to be steeper. Okay, that doesn't really pass through the point I want it to. It needs to cross the demand curve at least roughly the same point. So here it is. Here's my inelastic supply. Okay, so now I'm going to impose the same value of tax on both of these supply curves, holding the demand curve fixed. So that means I need the same vertical height. I'm using, again, my highly high-tech cheap TV remote from my apartment from when I was a grad student. So, well, it hasn't changed in height, so it's working out just well. So let's look at the inelastic supply first. And that gets us a tax that's going to impose this quantity here. Whoops. And with that tax, we get a deadweight loss equal to this triangle here. Okay. Now, if we had the more elastic supply curve, then if we impose the same tax, then I'd be looking for a height between the elastic supply curve and the demand curve, which, if I get the same distance in between them, that would have to be about here. Here's my tax. And how much deadweight loss would we get? Well, it's going to go between, it's going to trace out the demand and the supply curves to the right of the quantities that we miss out on, right? So in this situation, here's our quantity with a tax too. Okay. So now we're going to ask which one of these triangles is bigger? Is it the one with the elastic supply or the inelastic supply? And again, to do this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this triangle and translate it so that the vertical lines, which are the same height, line up with each other. Okay, so let's go over here again. Try and draw those out. Okay, so to start off with, here's my tax. And I'm holding my demand curve fixed, so let's put that through here. And I've got my relatively elastic supply. And I've got my relatively inelastic supply, which looks like this. Okay, and let's work out which of these triangles is bigger. Okay, so my elastic supply, that was the pink triangle in my previous diagram, so let's make it the same triangle, or the same color here. There's my deadweight loss for my elastic supply. Well, what about the inelastic supply? Did I use yellow there? Yes, good. That's just going to be this triangle here. So we know that the deadweight loss now for the elastic supply is going to be larger, right? So more elastic supply means larger, again, larger deadweight loss. Okay, so just as a recap from what we had with demand, we had more elastic demand means larger deadweight loss. And now we've got more elastic supply also means larger deadweight loss. Again, why do I keep writing B's here? Okay, so what this is telling us is that, well, firstly, if either demand or supply is elastic, or one of them becomes more elastic, so, that could be something like a longer time horizon, in which case both demand and supply would probably get more elastic because consumers and producers can adjust to price more in the long run, the deadweight loss is going to increase. Okay, this is actually a useful result for government policy, and we'll get to this in chapter 12, but, this is something we could work out now. If the government needed to raise some money to pay for a project that, it had already committed to or knew that it had some large benefits, the way to do this at lowest cost, that is to impose the smallest deadweight loss on society, would be to find a market that has very inelastic demand and supply, right? If we have a market with very inelastic demand and supply, then the deadweight loss is going to be small, right? That's this area in here. Whereas if we have a market with very elastic demand and supply, then the deadweight loss is going to be larger. Okay, and maybe I could label these correctly. Here's supply and here's demand. Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm James Bland, and I'll see you later.